On with the show. It's been a fascinating week of events so far. We've heard from community-led housing groups and the challenges and problems they have with getting their projects off the ground. We've jumped into the challenges of housing justice and ensuring equality and inclusion in the community-led housing process, and more that needs to be done in that regard. We've looked ahead to housing after the pandemic, and this morning we looked at how to scale up community-led housing. And in this session, we're looking at we talked a bit about the local authority role this morning, but we're going to go into that in a bit more detail. Local authority role in enabling community-led housing, but also with a focus on self-build as well. We're delighted to have three speakers. Fiona Brown, Duncan Hayes, and Kweli Mukherjee with us. They'll be making we'll make their slide presentations available after the festival, so keep an eye out for them. Just a quick general introduction from me before I pass over to the speakers, just to help frame the debate about the value of community-led housing to local authorities. At community-led housing, we think that community-led housing is about more than building houses. Factors such as social benefit and permanent affordability are central to community-led schemes. And we know from recent research that this type of housing is economically viable in the Thames Valley housing market. But when elements such as ongoing cost to residents, social value, enhanced life chances are included, then community-led schemes become investments in wider societal goals, such as skills and employment, neighbourliness and community resilience, and well-being and economic development. Toby Lloyd, one of our speakers this morning, suggested that community-led housing perhaps ticked too many boxes in terms of a communications message to local authorities. But that's exactly what I'm going to do now for a couple of minutes and just spin through some of those wider benefits. So in terms of better homes and meeting housing needs, community-led homes are providing benefits to people across the country and have done for a long time. Local authorities such as Cornwall, Cambridgeshire, Peterborough, boroughs of London now see community-led housing approaches as key viable means to create warm and affordable homes for people. In particular, community-led approaches are seen as very useful for people under the age of 40 or for households with below average incomes. And that could include a vast range of people. I mean, it could be teachers, doctors, nurses, people who work in shops and restaurants, factory workers. Many of these people are struggling with housing costs, and we need them for properly functioning communities. In addition, the pandemic's thrown into sharp relief the importance of health and well-being, of course, and research shows that community-led schemes put a strong emphasis on ensuring people can live healthy, happy lives in their own communities. Co-housing for older people, for example, offers age-friendly living environments and may reduce the need for residential care. Looking at economic benefits, community-led housing schemes can retain resources within the local economy. Public and private sector spending is retained in the area, and community-led organisations tend to increase local employment and increase the business of local traders and services. Then there's a climate emergency. Community-led schemes have been shown, and it's probably a very common theme, to engage much more readily with the low carbon and zero carbon agenda. Typically have much more environmentally friendly construction and often improved air quality as a result. So that's just a whistle-stop tour through some of those wider benefits of community-led housing, all of which are important, of course, to citizens, but also to the policies and programs and corporate aspirations of local authorities. So I'm going to pass on to the speakers now. First up is my wonderful colleague at Collaborative Housing, Fiona Brown. Fiona, she won't thank me for saying this, has over 30 years experience in social housing and has worked in housing management, strategy and policy work within a local authority context at Charwell District Council. While she was there, she was part of the BUILD programme, which provided affordable self-build opportunities for local residents and also led to the setting up of the Hook Norton Community Land Trust. So I'll pass on to you now, Fiona.
Thanks, Tom, and brilliant, Tamara. Thanks very much for loading the slides. Yeah, hello everybody. Yeah, I'm really just wanted to, I think, to start off the afternoon, just set the scene a little bit. As some of you who were on the call this morning will be aware, the Hub did a piece of research for the Oxfordshire Growth Deal last year. And as part of that, we tried to pull on good practice from around the country. And, you know, what could we adopt in the Thames Valley region? This is specifically for Oxfordshire, but it's applicable to the whole region. What sort of things could we adopt here that would really support the delivery of community-led housing and make it, you know, really just enable it to become a bit more mainstream, a bit more deliverable, not to be quite as many barriers in the way as groups have faced traditionally, in particularly in Oxfordshire. You know, we've got groups who've been working for years and years and years to try and make projects happen, and it's very hard. And as Paul mentioned, I mean, this is nothing new really. There are three things I think that community-led housing groups need to be able to deliver, and that's they need access to funding, they need access to land that they can afford, and they also need some supportive policy, supportive planning policies, supportive housing policies that allow local authorities really to sort of have a hook in order when they're assessing the deliverability of schemes that come forward. So in this, I've just drawn a little bit on some of the good practice that we highlighted in that report. The first one really is around funding, which takes the form, obviously can take the form of a grant programme, and that could be revenue or capital, but we go on to see that there are other sorts of funding mechanisms as well. And so for this, I mean, the grant funding has been particularly important in the light of the Community Housing Fund having shut down last year, closed down last year, and obviously we're now waiting for the detail on a funding programme for this year. But that funding programme is very small; it's only for 1 year. So we felt, I think, in the region as a whole, we were in a position where we had a lot of early groups, and they hadn't already had access to the Community Housing Fund, and it's been a really difficult year in terms of supply of grant funding, both to get groups started, but also you know, to help them really get towards purchasing a site and getting a planning permission on that site. So and that's been telling, and obviously the other sources of funding that have been available have tended, you know, obviously not only did the Community Housing Fund close, but there was also the small matter of the pandemic, and so a lot of funding did actually understandably get targeted towards issues that communities were facing around the pandemic in particular, and being able to recover from that. But we did give a good practice example here around Leeds City Council. And I think what's important with this, yes, they've got their grants programme from their Right to Buy setups, sales, and so a little bit of detail around that there. But it's very much, the funding is very much embedded in a more holistic policy support for community-led housing. So they've got political leadership there, they have a champion, and they've got officer support within the local authority to support community-led housing. They have an asset transfer policy to be able to lease empty homes at low rents, and proactively support Leeds Community Homes, the local hub, which in itself is a CLT, and provides support for the development of community-led housing across Leeds. And also land opportunities, for example, the Chapeltown co-housing project has been a land opportunity that came through the local authority. So I suppose the point here really is about, yes, grant's important. Yes, groups need grant, but it needs also to be within a more holistic programme. Can I have the next slide, please? Brilliant, yeah. But of course, it doesn't we're also quite conscious, I think, of the lack of public money around, particularly within local authorities, and so we're also interested in exploring opportunities for investment by councils, and a good example of that is the long-standing, very long, probably the first place in the country to have this revolving loan fund, which essentially pays for abnormal site costs, infrastructure costs, etc., and gets repaid into the fund. So we are, and that was one of the key recommendations that came out of the Oxfordshire report, really, was that could we explore that? Could we explore who might invest into that fund, and how could that operate, and who would operate it? And we're still, I think, again, that report was issued just prior to COVID last March, and the local authorities have definitely had other things on their minds, I think, but for understandable reasons. But we're really hoping to be able to kickstart that work with them now. What has happened actually is that there is an affordable housing element to the growth deal funding that the area received. And what councils have agreed to do is be able to use their Section 106 community sums money to be able to top up the grant from the growth deal, because at that point in particular, the growth deal grant was at a set rate. So that has been really helpful. Just all the local authorities went back, got that agreed internally, and some of them have now published policies around being able to use that money to support community-led housing in particular. So as well as those sort of direct funding interventions, we also looked at indirect interventions, mainly through council development vehicles, whereby councils have set up an operational arm to do development on their land or land that they purchase. And really good national example of that is with Palace Green Homes in East Cambridgeshire, who are their arm's length development company, and have partnered in quite major ways with community-led housing groups, and being quite flexible, really, and innovative in the way that they've done that. And that's been part of their DNA, I think, to do that. And similarly, we have got some of those companies within the region, and some more in stages of setting up. And we've been working particularly with Oxford City Homes, which is the development company for the city, looking at potential opportunities for partnership with groups on some of their sites that are coming through their pipeline. And also doing some work with Wokingham Council as well, who have got a piece of land where they're experimenting with self-build housing there, potentially through their development arm as a development partner for that. Something else, I'm not going to major on this because I know we've got a speaker who's going to speak to this, but just wanted to mention areas which have now brought forward land disposal policies, which have been extremely helpful for community-led housing groups. And in Bristol have just completed their first disposal tender exercise on their sites, and a number of community-led housing groups have benefited from land through that policy. So I think there's a lot we can learn from both London and Bristol in terms of how they, not only how they've done that in a really kind of transparent and procedural way, but also have taken social value into account on those. And then finally, just looking at policy, planning policy. I guess one of the outstanding policies still around is probably East Cambridgeshire. I know a lot of other authorities are now doing similar work within their local development frameworks. But I think the interesting thing about East Cambridgeshire is that they they've actually developed an SPD on how their policies should be applied to community-led housing. And I think that's sometimes locally, what we have locally is we have a lot of authorities now who've adopted a kind of percentage requirement for self-build, some of whom mention community-led housing as part of that or in addition to self-build. But there's still a long way to go, I think, in terms of how that gets delivered. And one of the things we're looking at is how, how an SPD can really help detail the delivery of that self-build land that's identified as usually as part of large sites. I think that's all from me. Thank you. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you very much for that, Fiona. Yeah, we spoke this morning about how we're starting from a relatively small base when it comes to the amount of community-led housing projects across the country compared to other countries in Europe, and how the top-down support is all important to this. But it's really nice to see all those positive examples of what's happening around the country. If we could have much more of this, more policy and more support for community-led housing at local authority and other strategic levels, it could really be transformative. So thank you for that. I'm going to pass straight on to our next speaker, Duncan Hayes. Duncan is the Marketing and Communications Executive at the National Custom and Self-Build Association. He's got over 10 years experience in custom and self-building, and in his current role, he helps secure sector growth, lobbying government and educating industry and consumers about the opportunities of self-build. So looking forward to hearing a lot more about your work, Duncan.
Sure thing. Okay. Hello, everyone. So I'm going to be doing the next slide thing as well. I'm just going to be giving you, if you go to the next slide, I've probably got too many slides, but if you, yeah, so I'll just be giving you an overview of what custom and self-build is really, and talking about the route and also about the right to build and local authority action. Okay, next slide. So just to give us a brief introduction about me and my role. So I work with the National Custom and Self-Build Association, which is a lobbying body. So we campaign for more opportunities with government, and we've got a consumer site, and we've also got a site where people can find their right to build register, which is actually just a page. But I also work with the Right to Build Task Force, and I'd like to thank them for a lot of these slides have come from them. They're a community interest body who work with local authorities to deliver policy and guidance, to support policy and guidance practice. And they've got lots of free resources on their sites, but they're primarily focused on local authorities, but they do some other work. Okay, next slide. So there's an interesting thing here that custom and self-build is a statutory duty, and government has put a lot of emphasis on it recently. They've just launched a self and custom build action plan that's got a whole range of elements included in it to help promote growth of the sector and help scale it up. Currently, there's open for bids for local authorities on their own land, the 25 million Brownfield Land Release Fund, Self and Custom Build Fund. They've also announced a 150 million Help to Build Fund, which will give consumers access to finance, we hope in a similar way to Help to Buy did for the mainstream market, but the details have not come out yet completely. They've commissioned a review of the right to build legislation to see how it's working in practice. And they've also commissioned Richard Bacon to do a review of the entire sector. So he's talking to a range of stakeholders, industry, consumers, to find out what are the blocks in this sector, what are the opportunities, where's the challenges. So that's ongoing now. There's also funding for the Right to Build Task Force. So they've got funding from MHCLG, and that funding enables them to do initial workshops with every English local authority about how they work with custom and self-build, and that serves as an introductory to their service. And then government's also updated the NPPG on custom and self-build and published data around the right to build. So it's all got quite serious in the last 6 months or so, which we welcome as an industry body. Okay, next slide. So this is just a quick note about the OPE fund because it is open now. The deadlines are quite tight to the 2nd of June, but it's the first time this has ever happened. It's only on sites that have got blockage on council-owned land. So we're eagerly hoping that people will be applying. So I just wanted to flag it up in case there are any local authorities on this session. Okay, next slide. Thank you. So just a quick overview. Self-build is when you literally commission someone to build your home. It's a misnomer that people build it themselves, but that's the kind of the routine. Custom build, for those who are not aware, you work with an enabler. That's typically a builder or a specialist developer who's helping you along the road. And these typically are on multi-plot sites, but you can also self-build on multi-plot sites, so it's a spectrum. But custom build offers ready to go plots normally, so they have services in infrastructure around roads, and whoever's purchasing the plot can customize their home. Both approaches can be used by groups of people. You can self-build collectively as a group on a site, and you can custom build as a group. Okay, next slide. So the benefits of custom and self-built housing, which, as Toby said earlier, there's too many benefits to mention, and they're not necessarily a good thing, but it's the same for custom and self-build in that it offers choice to the market. It can help with affordability. There are sweat equity routes, but there's also sort of other routes that can support affordability. It really does offer community cohesion in the same way that community-led housing can offer, which can be an important factor when you're working as part of a larger site. And there's real beauty in diversity of housing. So again, someone was talking about monotype housing estates rolling through the countryside. This route does not offer that. It's a remedy to that. So for councils, it can accelerate and grow housing supply. Letwin Review showed that diversity could help build out rates. It improves housing choice and quality, and within that, there's a lot that this route and community-led housing can deliver for BAME communities, people with specific housing needs. This will enable you to build what you can't buy in the wider market. It can support local economies and smaller builders. It's all built by SMEs, so for councils, that's a good thing to be seen to be promoting, and as well local training opportunities. It tends to build modular and more sustainably, and it tends to garner fewer planning objections. So I think this hopefully ties into one of the points earlier on about how do we engage with councils and persuade them that our route is a good one. These are some of the benefits. For local builders and landowners, it offers a new route to market, and it can speed up their build out as well. And it improves the site's marketability. So the fact that you're offering choice, you're not selling the same product as a red brick house down the road. And if you're working with a council, the custom build route with an enabler can help share the risk a bit. Okay, can I have the next slide? So it comes in a range of types of development. There are a lot of people that still think it's only on detached plots, which is courtesy of the legacy of Grand Designs, but it's far more about that. You'll see several terraced models on there on these images, but it can be small, large, it can be infill, it can be exception sites, it can be on brownfields as a regeneration. We are also seeing different models. So there are the first shell flats available in London where you can buy a shell flat and customize it and finish it yourself, either commission the builder to finish it. So it's really a range of routes. And then if they have the next slide, please. And as well as the range of routes, it can be delivered by a range of models. So you could be doing it by yourself, but it also includes several routes for community-led housing, community land trust, especially co-housing. And then there are other models that can be applied to it, as you can see there. And then if I have the next slide. So the task force has a range of advice for local authorities, because just like you've been discussing on these sessions, one of the issues that custom and self-build faces is a lack of knowledge, a lack of skills sharing. So the task force exists to plug that gap. And one of the things it's done to do that is to publish planning guidance for custom and self-build. I'm not sure if you're aware from a planning perspective, I'm sure you all are, but Joe Lavis did an amazing planning guide for community-led housing. So this is a kind of a custom and self-build version of this. There's also advice notes on how to deliver, and all of this is free. So any of the content that you see in these slides, this presentation, you'll find really quite in-depth detail on the Right to Build Task Force's website. Okay, next slide. So the Right to Build it's not an official name, but that's what the legislation has become known as. This is what I was saying, that it's statutory. So it came about from the House Building Act of 2015 and then was amended in 2016. The amendment put a duty on councils. So the first part said councils must hold a register and have regard of that with their wider housing duties. The second part then placed a duty on them to permission sufficient development permissions, to grant sufficient development permissions. What that means is the council or the local authority does not need to provide plots, but they do need to weigh that up. So the registers become a form of evidence for them. And they are now expected to track their activity. It's not a simple process, and anyone on a local authority will acknowledge that. If I have the next slide, please. So, and it's cyclical, so it's only for England. Anyone can sign up to the Right to Build registers, although there are some challenges that councils can levy, so financial tests or local connection tests. But it's for individuals and for groups, and that's what's a really important message here, because one of the things for community-led housing is how do you let the local authority know that you are a group and you're serious and you want them to consider you. This is the way to do that. So you can find your register on the Right to Build portal website, which is the URLs at the bottom. The registers operate on a 3-year rolling basis, after which time the councils must permission its sufficient plots. So if they've got 100 people that have signed up by the end of 2017, they're 3 years on from the close of that, so in that 4th year, they need to evidence that permission. And they are a vital form of demand for the local authority in actually planning. So this is part of a wider housing strategy. Next slide, please. So as you, oh no, this is fine. So how are local authorities meeting demand? What we're seeing is a range of routes in. It's quite interesting, Fiona mentioned several of these, but we're seeing policy come through now, because being a statutory duty, councils need to work out how they are fulfilling that. Sometimes that's percentage policies where they might require 5% of major sites over 50 homes to have 5% allocation for custom and self-build. It might be allocations, it might be acknowledging exception sites. There's a whole range of ways they can do that. It might be through land disposal policies, SPDs, financial support like Fiona mentioned, but it really is a spectrum of provision out there. So, and then next slide, please. And how are they doing? So NATSPA does track activity. This is the data for 2019, and it shows that where we are is quite a long way from where we want to be. And that's partly why the review of the Right to Build legislation is taking place this year. So we're going to be looking at, well, government will be looking at what's working, what's not working, how can it be improved? Because ultimately this is about providing additional homes. Next slide. So in terms of community-led housing, a lot of community-led housing will be custom and self-build. Some models are, some aren't, but it depends on the initial, I've said owner there, but it's the initial occupier of the house. The definition sets out that that initial occupier must have design input into the home. Where that can fall foul for some community-led housing is the fact that it's on a long time frame quite often. So that means that people can fall out of bed on the way, so that we are aware there's grey areas where, for example, one of the schemes I'm going to talk about in a minute, there are people that would have had input into their design of their flats, but because the schemes take 5 to 6 years to get going, their circumstances have changed, they've moved on. So hopefully what we'll see in the review is something that acknowledges that long time frame. An example of where it wouldn't be community-led housing wouldn't fall into custom and self-build is if it's built by someone else. So if it's more philanthropic, a community or a parish, and they're selecting people, or for example, the council's selecting people from their housing need register. In that case, those initial occupants wouldn't have the design input. So it wouldn't fall into custom and self-build. So it's not clear-cut in a lot of cases. Next slide. And then next slide again. So this is just a few case studies that show schemes that you would think of as purely community-led housing, but actually they are custom and self-built housing as well. So I'm sure you'll be familiar with these. They're all have won gluts of awards and have been in lots of papers and things. So this is the Older Women's Co-housing in Barnet. It's the first senior co-housing community in the country, and it provided 25 units for older women. And it's only older women that are allowed to live there. If one of them gets a boyfriend, that's not going to happen. So they need to find a different solution. But it's mostly owner occupied, and there is some social housing. It's built on traditional co-housing principles. So there are common spaces, there's common gardens, there's common kitchens and living spaces. But equally, every unit's got its own kitchen and living rooms. They're all independent. A mix of types, a mix of tenures. And as you know, this offers huge benefits locally to local authorities in the fact that those communities are looking out for each other. It helps combat the isolation that can come with ageing. They manage themselves. So there's masses of benefits in it. If I can have the next slide, please. And this is another London-based one. This is Russ in Church Grove, which has been supported by Lewisham Council. It's 33 units going in. And this is flats where people have customised their home. They've been involved with a lot of building. They've got their own academy for teaching people how to self-build, and it's on a community land trust model. It's simple and cost-effective, but this scheme picks up on one of the points that one of your people mentioned earlier, that effectively community-led housing is quite often amateurs. It's just people operating in a very professional realm, and they have to engage on the same level as someone like Barrett's would have, with the depth of their pockets and their ability to sort of access barristers and specialists. For community groups, you have to sort of be able to sort of step up to the same challenge. For planners, they can't really change the barriers just because you're a community housing group. So it can be a tough nut, which is why groups like Collaborative and the Right to Build Task Force are out there to try and help and spread this good practice and inform policy and SPDs that actually help make things better. Next slide. So, and this is Marmalade Lane. This is won numerous awards. It is a 40-home low-cost scheme in Cambridge. It came out of a bit of land that was left over that the developers did not build on after the financial crash of 2007, and the local authority was looking at a way to bring this forward. The community have had a massive input into what it is, how it is. So the street you can see there is their kind of central street that's children playing on. It's packed full of toys. There's no cars on it. The cars are all tucked away in a car park around the back. The houses were all customizable. So you could work out if you wanted like one huge room or different rooms. There's different facades you could have. And then there's also apartments in this scheme, there's houses. So as an example of how self-build and community housing can be the same thing. And then if you carry on, next slide, please. I've just got a few examples of how some of the practice that we've seen. Sorry, that's my alarm to make me be quiet. So one of the things that the task force is able to advise about, this is just an example of many, is that design codes are very useful for anything like this from a planning perspective. They offer surety to planners, to neighbours in the environment, to the people that are going to be moving into the scheme, and they'll set the standard for what's to be expected on the development. That might be heights, volumes, materials, palettes, which is what you've got here. This is an example of a materials palette. And then that's normally, if I have the next slide, that is typically in good practice paired with plot passports. So that will set out on a plot level what can be built, what the expectations are. It could have barrier treatments, it could have requirements for where you can put a garage if you're allowed, heights, materials, where the services are. So that spells out on a project level and on an individual plot level what you can build. And then I think I've got one more slide. So this is a learning that's come through as well. This is a community self-build scheme, but this is about CIL. So custom and self-build is exempt from the community infrastructure levy. So that represents a saving. I'm not sure how that would work with community-led groups per se, but this is definitely a community scheme. What's Water Lilies, this is Water Lilies in Brighton by Bright Green Futures, what they learned on their way, and I've used this to illustrate that planners don't always know everything about this route, is that to apply for the CIL exemption is very precise, and you end up having to create each unit as a phase. If you don't do that, for example, this has a terrace model on it. If they'd done it as one terrace being a phase of development, the entire CIL would have become chargeable had one of those people moved out within the 3-year time limit. So there's a lot of nuances working within the planning system, the law, the rules that govern different things. So I've just included that as an example. And then I think that's the last slide. So thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Duncan. That's quite an alarm you've got there. I hope that's not the one that catapults you into the day.
Yeah, I know.
No, thanks a lot for that. I mean, that's clarified a lot of things in my mind about self-build. So cheers. And you also covered a point that I was going to raise later, because it came up this morning. Somebody made the point that self-build isn't community-led housing. So thanks for covering that off. So moving on, our final speaker, last but by no means least, it's Dr. Kweli Mukherjee. And Kweli manages the Small Sites, Small Builders programme at the Greater London Authority. And she's worked in housing policy and delivery roles, managing a number of high-profile projects over the last 13 years. Her work on housing companies' English partnerships helped pave the way for a new era of council home building. and as chair of the GLA's Viability Task and Finish Group in 2015, Quelly developed proposals which now help secure more affordable housing through planning. So really looking forward to your presentation, Quelly.
Great, Tom, thank you very much for the introduction. So I work within the public land team at the GLA, and we'll soon be publishing a knowledge sharing report called Small Sites, Big Vision. And it's about the work that we've been doing with public landowners over the last 4 years. And I think the approach that we've developed can be used effectively to enable community-led housing and self-build, not just in London, not just in the London context, but across the country. So I hope the presentation enables you to think about, the elements that could be usefully applied in the Thames Valley area. Can I next slide, please? Thank you. So over the next 10 minutes probably, I'll cover the following things. So firstly, I just want to touch on why our initiative is focused on small sites in particular and the opportunities they present. Then I'll cover some of the delivery challenges, some of which kind of Fiona outlined at the start, and how we have sought to address those through our Small Site, Small Builders programme. I'll talk about our approach and the tools that we've developed, such as our portal. I'll highlight some of the ways that local authorities have used our portal to support community-led housing and self-build. And finally, I'll summarise some of the learning from our work. Next slide, please. So we know that small sites have a really crucial role to play in meeting house building targets, but we wanted to demonstrate how publicly owned sites can be leveraged to support much broader objectives. And these include, it's not limited to these, but it includes like securing affordable housing and different types of housing, diversifying the house building sector and providing opportunities to a range of small builders, and driving innovation and public value. Next slide, please. So there are, of course, many challenges with small sites delivery, and I'm sure this list, which you'll receive in the slide pack, will seem very kind of familiar to many of you. So what I'd like to do is focus on the methods that have been typically used for site development, which we feel haven't been fit for purpose. So with site auctions, the landowner can't ensure quality or delivery, and the site could be traded multiple times without actually being built out. And any affordability requirements can only be met through the planning process, which can be kind of challenging on sites with less than 10 units. Now, the other method is development agreements, which are lengthy and complex. The procurement process for selecting a developer acts as a barrier for smaller organisations who are often best placed to develop smaller sites. Next slide, please. So in response to these challenges, the GLA set up the Small Site, Small Builders programme, and the idea is to provide a streamlined service to help bring publicly owned sites forward for residential development. And the other goal is to stimulate the small builder market, providing opportunities to a range of small builders, including community-led housing groups and self-builders. Next slide, please. So in order to kind of find a balance between auctions on the one hand and kind of complex procurements with development agreements on the other, we established a kind of informal tender process, a competitive disposal process, whereby bidders can submit designs and financial offers for sites which are advertised on a portal that we've developed, and there's a kind of screenshot of that on the slide. So owners can then sell the site using public landowners can then sell the site using our standard leases, which are available on our website. The contracts are designed to incentivise development, and crucially, the selected bidder only pays for land once planning's been secured. The restrictive covenants can also be used in the lease to ensure community-led housing or affordable housing remains in perpetuity. So when these opportunities are available on the portal, we notify everyone that's signed up to our mailing list, and we've currently got over 1,200 subscribers on our mailing list. And another important feature is that we market the sites with due diligence reports. So, for example, a planning statement, topographical surveys, rights of light surveys, and this helps remove uncertainty for bidders and achieve more credible offers for public landowners. So in total, we've advertised 59 sites on the portal to date, and I'm now going to highlight some examples of how local authorities have successfully marketed their sites to community-led housing groups and self-builders in their areas. So the first local authority to use our portal was the London Borough of Croydon, and they used it to market a site called the Lawns for community-led housing. And I think some of the factors that made the bidding process successful was that they'd already developed a strategic approach for community-led housing provision. They'd thought carefully about the most suitable sites to consider for a pilot project and had a good understanding of the site through the due diligence work that had been completed. They held a series of community engagement events before the site was marketed on our portal. And they developed a really good scoring criteria for selecting a preferred bidder, which is still available on our portal. Next slide, please. So more recently, we marketed 2 sites for Tower Hamlets Council. Again, they did some very useful work in advance of marketing the sites. They commissioned a site identification study. They developed an affordable self-build programme, which involved creating the self-build register, and I now know where that comes from. From that, they were able to invite people to their self-build forum, and they worked closely with the London Community-Led Housing Hub before marketing the site. And so when the bidding closed last month, they received 13 bids for the Lark Rose site and 6 for Christian Street, and the bidder selection process is currently underway. So we look forward to seeing who's selected for these sites. Can I have the next slide, please? So this is an example from the London Borough of Hackney, who used our portal to market a site that was too small for their council-led schemes. Again, getting buy-in from across the organisation was key to successfully launching their self-build challenge and marketing of their sites. This site was actually so small that rather than using our standard leases, they offered the site with a share of freehold arrangement. So the council retains ownership of a percentage equivalent to the land value once the home's built, and this means the self-builder doesn't have to pay for the land. So the council received 40 submissions for this site, which demonstrates that, a really high level of interest in this kind of initiative. Next slide, please. So this final slide brings together some of the learning from our programme, which has been pulled together by PRD Solutions, who conducted an evaluation of our work. And through the evaluation process, we've identified 5 key principles for public landowners that are interested in marketing their sites to self-builders, community-led housing groups and other types of small builders. So firstly, the importance of finding the right sites can't be underestimated. This involves working with planners to define a framework to assess sites. So you might want to consider the criteria listed here relating to size and site layout, surrounding uses, easements and rights of way, daylight and sunlight assessments. It's also important to understand early on the resources required to bring a site forward, including staffing resources. Secondly, carrying out thorough due diligence, and this will enable bidders to submit the credible offers and bids with greater confidence, and it also helps with identifying and planning risks. Thirdly, using some sort of platform to market your sites, and this will help ensure equal access to opportunities. Another key factor for success is developing the clear bidding guidance, and that was a feature of all the 3 examples that I highlighted. Fourthly, creating a shared purpose across your organisation. It's also useful to create a supportive, well, it's really important to create that kind of supportive planning environment, including drawing on guidance for developing good quality homes. And finally, providing support and guidance to bidders and signposting them to where they can receive assistance. So, I mean, I don't know the landscape in the kind of Thames Valley area, but I'm sure that many of the organisations that were represented in the festival can provide that valuable support. So just with my closing slide, I just to say that, like many of the presenters, I've given a kind of very whistle-stop tour of the last 4 years. If you do want to view any examples in more detail, you can head to our portal and see things like the standard leases, the bidding guidance for sites that we've marketed, because we kind of keep all those details on the portal even after the deadline for submissions has passed, because that helps with the kind of sharing resources and sharing learning. So we will of course circulate our full report with the festival organisers when that's ready, and that can be circulated. So thank you very much for listening.
That's great. Thanks very much, Coeli. That was really interesting. I mean, it's great to hear more about that really innovative approach that you're following at the GLA. It's good to get into the nuts and bolts of how you did it and how you've done it very successfully. I mean, it really came across to me as a roadmap for how to do it well. So thank you for your time on that. Okay, well, I think we've got about 10 minutes left in this session, so a bit of time for questions and comments. First of all, I think, Tamara, we're going to start with a quick poll, which is focusing on what you, our audience, think are the key barriers to releasing sites for self-build. So it's popped up on the screen now. There we go. So if you could very quickly vote. An absolute majority for lack of sites identified for self-build. That's interesting. So I'll maybe kind of put that back to our speakers. What your take on this is. Does this match with your experience? And perhaps you could kind of elaborate a little bit on that as, you know, as a challenge, lack of sites identified, and perhaps some of these other challenges too.
Yeah,
I can step it. Oh, sorry, do you want to go first, Kahili? Okay, thank you. If I can just say, I think this was part of the motivation behind the Right to Build legislation when it came in, was to encourage action that would bring on more sites and more housing, additional housing. Custom self-build delivers about 13,000 houses a year. A lot of those are automatically on bungalow replacements, garden plots, infill, small things. That housing will always churn. But the legislation was really had the ambition to actually create additional housing. And part of that, the Right to Build register, is to help those sites come forward. But we know it's small sites that make the difference, which is why, you know, with things like the CLA scheme, we really back. It's a brilliant way of using resource. But as someone said earlier, the point was that many local authorities don't have large land banks anymore because of the removal of their own housing stock. So while that is a route, we also need a different route to market for market-led opportunities. And that's one of the things that we look at in terms of policy, because that policy from a local authority perspective can help shape that from planning.
Thanks a lot for that, Duncan. Coeli, did you want to jump in? Yeah, sure. I mean, I definitely, that the poll definitely sort of rings true in from where I'm sitting as well, because with the Small Sites Small Builders programme, I mentioned that we've got like over 1,200 subscribers to our mailing list. So whenever sites go on the portal, we advertise to all of those subscribers, and we're really aware that I mean, to date we've marketed 59 sites to date, which is great, but we are conscious that you know, there's a lot more people that are bidding for sites than we, and you know, only one organisation is going to get the site that we advertise at any one time. So you know, there's obviously like the ratios involved. You can see that there's like a huge amount of demand compared to the amount of sites available, but we do hope that by kind of showcasing what we're doing, it's sort of, you know, the momentum's growing. So once we've kind of demonstrated to to the local authorities that we're working with that, you know, it's working, this process, it kind of brings other local authorities on board. So we started off originally when we launched the programme, only like 3 local authorities bid in the first round of funding, and that has gone up, and we're now engaging with 24 local authorities. So still not everyone in London, but you know, we're getting there. So certainly, yeah, hopefully we can kind of get more sites released. I mean, one of the things to say was that when we launched the programme, it was actually before our Building Council Homes for Londoners programme. So, you know, during the programme period, at some point, you know, some councils were kind of taking a look again at their kind of housing assets and looking at which schemes they were going to develop themselves. But still, we're aware that councils can't just deliver, you know, can't deliver all their small sites. So it's good to have this option available.
Can I just add as well that I think there's a battle of hearts and minds here. One of the people on one of the earlier sessions mentioned the importance of buy-in across local authorities, and that's very, very true for customer self-build, as I'm sure it is for community-led housing. In order to get buy-in, you really do need people across housing and planning. You need council members, you need parish councillors. They need to understand what the benefits are and what it can deliver, and also the fact that it is competing against quite often mainstream building. So as well as educating the people that are going to live in these communities, you also need to kind of educate the powers that be about the benefits and the challenges of the route to actually help. And I know, Fiona, you're from Cherwell back in the day when it was doing the build scheme. That's an example of a council that did do the strip feed thing, the same way as the GLA have done with the small sites. As their experiences have gone on, they've tried a bit more, and it's related in Cherwell Council developing Graven Hill, which has now got will eventually have like 1,900 self-build opportunities on there. There's a range of types and tenures. There's community-led housing, there's affordable housing, but it's got the largest number of custom and self-build. But it's because they've trialed something, they've seen it, they've had pilots, that's enabled them to grow into something else. So none of this is quick, but it all adds to sort of a critical mass.
No, thanks for that, Duncan, and that echoes back quite strongly, as you say, to that point we made in the previous session about the need for training. Claude talked about that quite strongly as well. The need to, you know, educate officers and also members, all importantly as well, about what we're talking about when it comes to community-led housing, self-build. And also coming actually just on that point, and we talked earlier on in the day about when we talked to the people about community-led housing, citizen-led housing, a lot of people go, what is that? But when you guys talk about self-build, that poll earlier on, do people know what self-build is? Do you find that people, do they get it?
No, they still don't, because of the Grand Design's perception that it's people on large plots building a single enormous house that they're laying the bricks themselves. And to be honest, that almost never happens. So one of the challenges we're facing is actually getting this message across that for this to really change, it's going to be on multi-plot sites, right. And that might be community-led or custom and self-built on those sites, but it's going to be those sites where you've got 10, 20, 100 plots available for people to build, or for groups to come together and build together on, because that's what will change people's perception. But you need those sites to come out of the ground, because it's when people see that something's happened locally, you only have to look at the roles that things like Lilac and Broadhempston CLT have done for actually how much they've educated, how much where they've led, other groups have followed. And it's the same example with the self-build registers. So councils that are active and doing things with the people on their self-build registers tend to have quite large self-build registers. Councils where there's nothing going on locally tend to have quite small registers. So it's a little bit of it is the field of dreams, build it and they will come sort of thing. So.
Always good to refer to Field of Dreams. Coeli, does that echo your experience in London? It seems that people maybe get it in a bigger sense there, or perhaps not.
I mean, what we have been doing, and one of the things that we have been thinking about is like how you kind of, in terms of how you get the message out, and building those kind of partnerships. So one of the things that we have been doing is like working with sort of talking about what we've been doing in different forums. So in the New London Architecture, Urban Design London, we've got Future of London, we've got all these different kind of networks and different organisations that kind of help spread like the message around what we're trying to achieve. So I think again that's something to think about, thinking about all the different networks in your areas, and you know who can help sort of co-host events or organize things together in partnership.
Yeah, that's a really good observation. I mean, we're talking earlier in the day about you know, generalizing the message about community-led housing and talking about it in the right way, in the right places, building up that kind of grassroots awareness of what it is, but also looking for that kind of top-down support as well. And thinking about where we're based in, this office is based in West Oxfordshire, and West Oxfordshire District Council has a policy that 5% of housing on strategic sites is set aside for self-build. So you can combine that to come back to the Field of Dreams and Kevin Costner, Duncan. It's, you know, bringing those two together is really going to be the game changer, I think. We're bang on 2 o'clock. So thank you so much again. At the times it's flown past again, the whole morning, the whole day has gone past really fast. So thank you everybody who stuck with us, and the new faces that joined us for this session at 1 o'clock. Do come back tomorrow. The festival does not stop here. We've got a session tomorrow that's talking about sustainable housing, how to design sustainable housing with communities. So that should be really quite interesting. And then to celebrate, we've got a social catch up in the afternoon, and it'd be great to see you all for that as well. But in the meantime, thank you so much to our speakers again, to Quelly, to Duncan, and to Fiona, and really hope to see you all tomorrow. Thanks a lot.
Thank you all. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you all.